Once again, I want to welcome everyone to the 4th annual Sabel Stahlgren award dinner of the China Center at Josef Korbel School of International Studies, University of Denver. My name is Sam Zhao. I'm the director of the Center for China-U.S. Cooperation. We have a lot of people who have helped to make this event a successful event. I want to take this opportunity to thank those who have helped to make this event successful. First of all, I want to thank our provost and who is here with us, Jeremy Tufler, for tonight support, and also Ambassador Chris Hill. He is also the honorary director of the Center for China-U.S. Cooperation. And also I want to thank China Center staff. Erin, people have been communicating with her. Erin McKay, she has worked very hard to make this event possible. And also we have student workers, Oliver Fisher, Liu Chang, Alex Hayes, and Catherine Worth, and Ted Ureth. Those students have been also sitting there, very helpful. Please join me to thank our staff and also for the students for their help, their support to make this event successful. And also, I want to thank those sponsors to this event. We have platinum sponsors who has contributed $10,000 to this event. We have Chilton Foundation, and Robin Chilton is here with us. Thank you so much for your support. And also we have Diana Lee, also as U.S.-China Bridge sponsor. She has been a long-time supporter to the China Center, and also, in fact, she was our first recipient of China-U.S. Bridge Award, and also she helped endowed Lee Stahlgren China Center Endowment. We want to thank Diana Lee for your support. Thank you so much. And then we have China Center's scholar sponsor. We have quite a few. John Vivian Sabel. John, thank you so much. And in fact, this dinner started with John's support and named with John and Vivian Sabel. Thank you so much for your support. And we also have a very special family in Denver who has been long-time supporter to the DU, to Korbel School, and to the China Center. That is Benton Nelson family, Margaret and Mark and Ed. Ed has been a very, very long-time supporter to the university and also to our China Center. We are so, so grateful. Ed, you have such a wonderful family. And thank you so much. And we have U.S.-China cooperation sponsors. We have Brooke, Mary Jo, Banbury. In fact, they are not here today. And they have been supporting China Center for many years. And also, of course, we have Larry Chen. They also sponsored one table. And also, we have Anna Zhang Xie Foundation. Their table have been seated with all our Xie fellows and also our faculty members there. Please join me to thank all those who have supported the China Center and also support to Korbel School to the university. And also, we have some special guests here today. We have a Japanese Council Journal and Hong Kong representative office representative from San Francisco. And we have, from Hong Kong, Michael Yan. Is that correct? pronunciation your name. Yeah, Michael, thank you for coming. And also for Ivan Ho Chen and Japanese Council Journal, our ambassador Hill will have a better pronunciation, so I leave that to him. Now, it's my honor to invite our provost, ambassador, and Larry, and our recipients of the best article recipient, Michael, Professor Namden, to the stage. And Diana, yeah. The first award will be the recipient of our first award will be introduced by Ambassador Chris Hill. He was our former dean. You have the honor and the pleasure to be in this beautiful building because of Ambassador Hill. He brought this building to the school, make the school very, very different place. That's why we can have this opportunity to have such a wonderful event in a school. So our Ambassador Hill will introduce our first recipient of our award. Ambassador Hill.
Hey, thank you. Thank you very much, Professor. First of all, I always thought the China Center could take care of everything, but they haven't taken care of the weather today. For those of you who are not from Denver, the chances are 320 out of 365 that you're going to have a sunny day, but somehow we've landed on the 45 to 365 days. But anyway, I do want to say that this event, which really began with the creation of the John Vivian Sabel and Lee Stahlgren Awards evening, it began some 4 years ago, but I think it's really been an opportunity to take stock of this just fabulous center that the Korbel School has. The China Center, I mean, look, we have a lot of important relationships out there in the world. There's none more important than our relationship with China. Frankly speaking, there's no relationship we have in the world that's more fraught than our relationship with China. It's always a mixture of cooperation and competition. Now it seems to be becoming more of a mixture of competition and maybe confrontation, and we don't want that. And I think what we have to do here in Denver, first of all, we are much higher in altitude than Washington, D.C. or Beijing, so we have to kind of look down at those two places and make sure that they manage this very precious relationship better than they've done in the last few years. You know, whether it's 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now, China and the U.S., we're going to be here. We're going to be here. And we need to kind of work things out. We need to establish more patterns of cooperation. When we disagree on something, and we do disagree on a lot of things, let's find some things we agree on. My candidate is always we should agree on getting rid of nuclear weapons in North Korea. I like to think that North Korea should be the country that brings us together. I like to think that you know, our president has talked about building statues. Let's build one to the North Korean leadership for what it's done to help China and the U.S. work together in recent years. But seriously, these are tough problems out there. These are very tough problems in terms of U.S. relationships, not just in China, but in all of East Asia. And, you know, as a former assistant secretary for East Asia, I have told many audiences the United States is really a Pacific country. We share the same ocean that China, that Korea, that so many other countries have. And we need to kind of work on this relationship. And what better place to do that than the China Center here in Denver, Colorado. Whenever we've had friends from China come to Denver, frankly, they love this place. They feel very much at home. They like our mountains, and for those of you who aren't here, we do have mountains. I just want to assure you, they're just not making an appearance tonight. But we have, I think Denver does a lot. We are truly a global city, and as such, we need global institutions, and none more so than this China Center, which is the work of this Professor Zhao. And I hope you all know he is really the genius who has put this together. And let me just say to Diana Lee, Roy, of course, passed away a couple of years ago. And if Roy Stahlgren had seen what we've done here with this center, I think he'd be very proud of all of us. But Diana, I think he'd be especially proud of you. So thank you very much. So my job tonight is to introduce the winner of the, frankly, the best article in the Journal of Contemporary China. Now, for those of you who don't know the Journal of Contemporary China, try buying a copy on the internet. You can't afford it. I mean, they're just hundreds of dollars to buy a copy of this great journal. And what they have done is really, I mean, thanks to Professor Zhao, he has readers from all over the country, very distinguished Chinese scholars, who look for good articles, excellent articles to put in this journal, and really to help this journal be the best journal on Chinese affairs that exists in the world. So we're very pleased that this year that the award, that the John and Vivian Sabel Award for the best article in the Journal of Contemporary China is Dr. David M. Lampton. That's a big name, so we're just going to call him Mike. And for his article, Xi Jinping and the National Security Commission, Policy, Coordination, and Political Power. It was published in volume 24, which has probably been stolen off the shelves right now, and I don't know how much you'd have to pay to get it back, but it's tough. Number 95 to, so well, I'm just going to call him Mike, is the Oxenberg Roland Fellow at Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University. That's sort of the University of Denver of the West Coast, for those of you who haven't heard of it. He is also the Hyman Professor, Director of SAIS China and China Studies at the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies. Mike is the author of more books. He's written more books than many people have read. You know, I thought of making that a political statement, but I'll just say that many people have read. He's authored a dozen books, monograms, including most recently Following the Leader, Ruling China from Deng Xiaoping to Xi Jinping, University of California Press, 2014. Testified at multiple congressional commission sessions, published numerous articles, essays, book reviews, opinion pieces of many venues, popular and academic in the Western world and in Chinese-speaking societies, including Foreign Affairs, Foreign Policy, the American Political Science Review, China Quarterly, the New York Times, the Washington Post, Sports Illustrated. No, I'm kidding about that last point. And over the course of his career, Mike is accompanied he's accompanied American public and private sector leaders to China and Chinese leaders to the U.S., and we need to keep doing that kind of stuff. He was in the past, he served as the president of the National Commission on U.S.-China Relations. He consults with governments, business, social sector organizations, served on the board of several non-government and educational organizations, including Asia Foundation, where he serves as a chairman. He's been the recipient of many academic awards, including this one, and he's the honorary senior fellow of the American Studies Institute of the Chinese Academy of Social Science, and the inaugural winner of the Scalapino Prize 2010, awarded by the National Bureau of Asia Research and the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars in recognition of his exceptional contribution to America's understanding of the vast changes underway in Asia. Let me just say, this guy is an amazing all-star, and we are honored that he is here. Thank you very much. And now we're going to have the provost of the University of Denver, Jeremy Hefner, present the award to Dr. Professor Mike. Yeah.
Thank you, Ambassador Hill. Now we are presenting the second award. The recipient will be introduced by Diana Lee. We all know who she is now.
Dr. Lambton, I read your article on Xi Jinping's building a National Security Commission in China with great interest. In fact, I read it twice. And you most definitely deserve the Sabel Award, and congratulations. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody. This evening, we are presenting the third anniversary Bridge Award to an individual who has made significant contributions to building relationships and understanding between the United States and China. Considering the global geopolitical climate of today, I think it is worthwhile to reflect on the origin of the Bridge Award. The bridge as metaphor has played a powerful role throughout China's history and influenced its cultural roots. In art and in the landscape, a bridge manifests itself as a structure or a crossing, which by its nature and the materials used because of the nature of the bridge and the material used, it has great utility and permanence. In the context of tonight's award, the bridge has an even deeper meaning. Its foundation, advancing education, and increasing exchanges, interactions, engagement. Its span, the engagement of others, and with these others, the exchange of ideas, and the building of relationships. The concept of engagement and the exchange of ideas reminds me of the director of our China Center. And the idea of the building of relationships reminds me of my late father and my late husband and the legacy they left behind. Through teaching, speaking, writing, and the editing of the Journal of Contemporary China, Professor Suisun Zhao, Sam to many, is a standard bearer of such a legacy. He aims to increase awareness, enhance understanding, and stimulate East-West engagement. With his well-informed insights on China, Sam is a global treasure to political leaders, scholars, students, and laymen. Almost 100 years ago, my father, Ho Ping-yin, studied in the United States, receiving degrees in economics. When he returned to China in the late 20s, amid the chaos of the late 20s and 30s, he worked hard to help build a new republic from a war-torn nation. He enabled young students to travel abroad, to study modern science and technology, and to learn all there is to learn about Western ideas, and to observe what constituted effective governance. My late husband, Roy Stahlgren, was a devoted student of Chinese culture and history. Upon retirement, Roy taught courses in Chinese history at several American universities, including here at DU. During his medical career, Roy did extensive volunteer medical services in third world countries. China was one of the countries he volunteered frequently. While there, he taught surgeons advanced surgical practices and in medical schools across the country, as well as in the People's Liberation Army. He shares his surgical skills with passion and showed genuine interest in each and every one of his students. Roy's engagement earned him fervent respect from those young professionals. This is the third anniversary of the Lee Stahlgren U.S.-China Bridge Award. The award honors a person who has made significant contributions in advancing knowledge and engagement between the East and the West. This is the very legacy advanced by tonight's Bridge Award honoree, Larry Chan. Lawrence Chan, MD, PhD, is professor of medicine at the University of Colorado and was the director of the transplant clinic at Anschutz Hospital. Growing up in Hong Kong, Larry received his education and medical training at University of Hong Kong, Edinburgh, Oxford, and Harvard. Eat your heart out, please. Growing up in Hong Kong in the 60s, Larry received his early schooling in traditional colonial style of that era. In 1976, while at Oxford, Larry encountered for the very first time students from mainland China. Those students were sent abroad as the first wave of students caused by Deng Xiaoping's China Great Opening Initiative, very much like in the 20s and 30s my father did. Those students opened Larry's eyes and awakened his interest in learning about China, its history, culture, and the life experience of those students. This interest ignited Larry's passion to mentor Chinese students from the Greater China region, the United States, and elsewhere. This effort continues undiminished. Dr. Chan co-authored a recently published book, Nobel and Lasker Laureates of Chinese Descent in Literature and Science. This book highlights the intellectual struggles and triumphs of noted scholars of Chinese heritage. In a recent South China Morning Post interview, Larry said that the purpose of this book is to encourage young doctors, Chinese doctors, students of science and writing to achieve international recognition in their respective fields. But decades before this book was written, Larry had been building bridges between the East and the West. He is the co-founder of the Chinese American Society of Nephrology. The core mission is to encourage educational exchange by providing training and guidance to the next generation of Chinese doctors. Tonight, I am thrilled to join all of you, including a legion of Larry's friends, in recognizing and celebrating Larry as the justly deserved recipient of the 2019 Lee Stahlgren U.S.-China Bridge Award. As an aside, Dr. Joseph Chen, Larry's son, flew in from New York for this occasion. Following his parents' footsteps, Joseph is obtaining his MD, PhD in oncology from Columbia University and the Memorial Sloan Kettering Cancer Center. Larry supported his wife, Dr. Cynthia Chan, in mentoring their son to becoming all that he is clearly becoming. Following the family tradition, Joseph has been busy building bridges between East and West. By the way, the father and son dynamic duo are co-authors of their recently published book. Like parents, like son indeed. Congratulations, Cynthia, Joseph, and our honoree, Dr. Lawrence Chen.
Thank you, Diana Lee, for such a wonderful introduction. Provost would present our award to Larry.
Yeah, please.
Okay, Larry would make a few remarks to the occasion. Here's the microphone. Yeah. No, not yet. Not yet. Yeah, not yet.
Well, thank you very much, Diana, for the very kind word. It's really touched me. Tonight is really a very special occasion for me, and I received this award because I have so many friends. With all their support, that's what I can do, what I'm doing. And I'm receiving on behalf of all my friends from University Club, friends from Nathan Yip Foundations, friends from colleagues in CU and friends in DU. Everybody been helping me to do what I'm doing. And my wife Cynthia, our son Joseph, for their love and care to allow me to do what I'm doing. And I really appreciate that. And to the leadership of DU, Korbel School, China Center, and Diana Lee for all your support, and we'll do more. And thank you very, very much for all this great honor.
Thank you, Larry. In fact, the 5 tables are friends of Larry and also his patients. Robin, for example, is a good testimony to how wonderful Dr. Chen is. And now we'll have our provost to make a few remarks here before we go. Yeah.
Well, good evening. I'm Jeremy Hafner. I'm the Provost Executive Vice Chancellor here at the University of Denver, and it is my absolute honor and delight on behalf of Chancellor Rebecca Chop and the Board of Trustees to, of course, welcome you to the 4th Annual Sabel and Lee Stahlgren Award dinner. And I will tell you that this is my first such dinner, and I am deeply, deeply impressed by the energy in this room, the congeniality of the people here, the friendliness of everyone, and the support for the work that the Center for U.S.-China Collaboration is all about. So this is really a wonderful event for me to be a part of, and I'm so pleased to have an opportunity to get to know all of you, especially thanks to the Sabel family who's joined us up here. Dr. Lee, for your wonderful words, and of course, our wonderful recipients of the awards. Dr. Lampton for the Sabel Award for Best Article in the Journal of Contemporary China, and of course, Dr. Lawrence Chen, recipient of the 2019 Lee Stahlgren U.S.-China Bridge Award. I just want to say a couple of words about these two awards because they were really quite impressive. The purpose of the Sabel Award for Best Article in the Journal really it goes to honor a global scholar who has made a contribution to the large scholarly community and policy world. But in this case, in particular, between the U.S. and China relations. And the way it's selected is not very typical in academia. Typically, we have a selection committee that looks at a variety of different letters that support the individual and so forth. But what I like about this award is it's based just purely on quantitative data. Namely, it's based on the citation index. And for those of you who don't understand what that is, let me just quickly say what it is. It means the citations are those other authors who cite this article in their articles. And so if you think about it for a moment, it's a way of measuring the impact that that article by Dr. Lampton has had. And the reason why he got the award is he had the highest number of citations for this journal over a 5-year period. So that means the impact of his article is pervasive in this particular discipline. So I think that's really impressive, Dr. Lampton, and we're so honored to have you here. And Dr. Chan, you know, I think the words that Dr. Lee shared about you say it all. But from a technology point of view, which is where a lot of my career has been spent, I noticed that you were a pioneer in the MRI use of that technology to help improve our lives. And I think all of us are very familiar with that technology and what it means to really make our lives better, healthier. And so for that, I thank you for your work in that regard. And it's just an honor to be up on this stage with you. So let's give the two award recipients another round of applause. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Lampton, who will deliver the keynote speech. So Dr. Lampton, please come on.
Before that, I want to thank our provost. Provost Jeremy Hafner has been here only the first year. That's why he is here first time. But the university has changed so much.
Not my last time, though.
No, hopefully not. Certainly not. Okay, so now the floor is Dr. Mike Lampton. He is giving a keynote speech about China-U.S. relationship, which is in a big turmoil. So he will give us, make sense how this relationship is and where it will go from here. He is the top authority on this relationship. He published a lot of books on this. As Ambassador Hill said, he published the books more than we can read. So see what we can find.
Well, good evening. It's great to be in Colorado. And I genuinely believe that. My father grew up in Colorado, Greeley and Fort Collins. I was on the board of Colorado College for many years. And my son went to Colorado College. Can people hear? People in the back hear okay? If somehow my voice trails off or I get separated from the microphone, just do some body language and tell me you've got a problem, and I'll raise the volume. I want to thank Ambassador Hill for two things. One, that overly gracious introduction, but I really want to thank him for his service to our country. I had the privilege of being in your office a couple of times with other more deserving people, but in any case, the degree of devotion he had to trying to work out not only what was good for America, but what was good for the world was really gratifying, and certainly left me with a deep impression. So thank you on all scores, Ambassador Hill. I'm, of course, honored to be the recipient of the John and Vivian Sabel Award. And I didn't, this evening, understand the methodology by which the provost explained. So that's great to know. But in any case, thank you for those nice remarks, and thank all of you for coming and giving me the opportunity to really talk about what I think is, it's not only been my life work, but also what I think is just very important to the future of this country, and not to mention Asia. That's Ohio. That's I think self-evident. And what I really want to do this evening is talk about three things. Where are we? How did we get here? What's the undergirding problem here? And what might we try to think about doing about it in a more constructive way? It's not enough for me just to analyze the problem, because I think we all have a sense of the problem, although maybe I'll give it a little more specificity than many of you have thought about. But I think for every problem, you ought to be thinking about what we can do to improve the situation. And of course, every suggestion has its own set of problems and infeasibilities. But that's sort of the approach I take. Now, I'm not going to say anything much about the article other than to use that as a kind of jumping off point. Frankly, I hadn't read my article in about 4 years, so on the plane, here, I did read it. I think looking back on it, it was the place where I first articulated publicly that I thought China was not going in a direction that was going to be maybe fruitful for the Chinese people, but that's for them to say, and going to create problems in the U.S.-China relationship. And that was about 5 years, 4 or 5, when you figure out how long it takes to write an article. The only quote I'd have from that, which is sort of the jumping off point for this evening, is that I said impulses for the commission. This article was about the establishment of something that we thought might be equivalent to the National Security Council in the United States. And the Chinese had been talking about how to organize their foreign policy making mechanism to deal with a more complicated world. As they became more involved financially, economically, militarily, they needed to coordinate their huge bureaucracy. But of course, national security doesn't mean just foreign policy, it means internal security. And there was a debate when this article came out about, is China going to, in fact, have a National Security Council that makes it easier to integrate China into the world in a predictable policy way? Or is it going to use the more narrow definition of national security, meaning internal security, police repression, and that genre? And the article hoped for the former, but feared for the latter. So this is when I said, impulses for the Commission's establishment are to advance Xi Jinping's drive to consolidate his personal power over the international and external coercive and diplomatic arms of the governing structure. He's less comfortable with professional foreign policy bureaucracy, and he's less comfortable with associated public intellectuals than were his predecessors. In other words, this was a person I feared that was becoming more internal control-oriented, not more cosmopolitan, expansive, in the sense of fitting in with the norms, values, and institutions that the United States has played such a major role in. So the long and the short of it is what I want to talk a little about is what's happened after this article. Why do and I've spent my whole life trying to be, and I am, ultimately positive, because I think the Chinese have transformed their society in a way that is going to ultimately require a more accommodating, but there's going to be a lot of time and a lot of activity between then and now. And the question really is how we can facilitate a more painless path to a cooperative future, because I don't think we have a choice, really, if we're going to deal with the world's problem, to have at least a minimally cooperative relationship with China. So this brings me really to tonight. And my central message is, and it isn't as, I guess as they say about Wagner's music, it's not as bad as it sounds. But at first blush, it's not a great message. And the message is that for 40 years, we've had a policy across 8 administrations, not including this, that was focused on some version of what we might reasonably call constructive engagement. And it was a gradual process that changed this relationship, but now we are really talking about a competitive, and I think as Ambassador Hill put it, possibly conflictual relationship. So the character of the relationship has changed, not because I or anybody here willed it, but because of a whole series of developments. And I want to talk a little about that. This is a timely time to make these remarks because this is the 40th anniversary of the normalization of U.S.-China relations. And if you think about it, most policies don't last that long. Engagement lasted almost 40 years, almost as long as the Cold War. So this has been a remarkably successful, I think, policy in the scheme of things. But policies wear out. And I think this policy at least needs a substantial overhaul. So why is it worn out and what do we do about it? That's really the question. Now, as I said, I want to say how we got to this juncture, what are the undergirding views and beliefs, particularly in Washington, but not limited to Washington. Unfortunately, policy on China now is a bipartisan policy. It may be the only one, maybe infrastructure will be another one, but this is now unfortunately become a bipartisan policy to frame China, and China's doing a lot to frame itself in a more adversarial, competitive direction. And then, as I said, I'd like to just say a few words about what we might do. First, how did we get to this stage? And I think that it'd be comforting if you think back to, and this isn't to take anything away from June 4th, 1989 and the tragedy that represented, but that was, in a way, a blip. That was a blip in our relationship because, frankly, both leaderships wanted to maintain relations and manage through that problem. Big problem, but we managed through it. That was a big blip, but nonetheless, China got on a reform track, and that carried us a number of decades more in our relationship. This is not a blip. This is not June 4th. This is a long-term secular, I would put it, decline in the relationship, and we should do what we can to minimize it, bring out the positive possibilities, but this is not going to be a simple problem to deal with. So why what do I mean by crumbling or long-term deterioration? I think for the last 40 years, this relationship had what I would call three central pillars. One was sort of security, it's called the strategic realm, the idea of military, national security in the narrowest sense kind of relationship. And of course, if you think, why did Richard Nixon go to China? The answer is that 2 dealing with the Soviet Union was better than 1 dealing with the Soviet Union. And we had the virtue of us in NATO presenting a problem to the Soviet Union on the European side, and China, just by its presence in Asia on the other side of the Soviet Union, compounded the Soviet Union's security problems, and thank you very much. That's what we wanted to do. And in the end, it was a remarkably successful policy. That's one of the pillars. The second was economic. And of course, we're all familiar with the explosion in economic activity, the fact China's the largest export market for American agricultural goods. You can say China's market saved GM in the downturn of 2008 and 9. There's that economic dimension to the relationship. And then there was the cultural and educational. And people don't realize how important that is, and I don't mean to reduce it to business in the narrowest sense, but this is a U.S. export industry, $13 billion. It's as big as soybean sales to China. This is the tuition and all of the associated fees, the Chinese 350,000 plus students. When President Carter normalized with Deng Xiaoping, he made an agreement. Deng Xiaoping said, we want to send students. Will you limit the number of students we can send? He said, no, as long as they can win scholarships or pay, there's no limit. And during this Cold War with the Soviet Union, it was 1 student for 1. As you might guess, we didn't have very many Soviet students. So this has been a diversified relationship of strategic rationale, economic rationale, and what we may call cultural, diplomatic, and educational. It's been a diversified, and when one part of the relationship during these 40 years has had a problem, another part would get stronger. So when the Soviet Union goes away and sort of weakens the security angle, well, then economics. It's the economy, stupid, right? And then when that becomes a problem, we've got all these students and cultural exchange. So it was a diversified, 3-legged stool, pretty sound. Well, what has happened is all 3 of those legs are weakening simultaneously. That didn't happen in the last 40 years. And it's, of course, a complicated story, but if I was to sort of try to strip it down to what I think are the essentials, is that our security relationship has gone south, and that this is metastasizing across the economic areas and the cultural, educational areas. That the human condition is such that people value security. That when they have to choose, they're going to choose that. Now, you have security's ups and downs, but at some point, when you make security the primary objective and it is on a long-term secular decline, it's going to infect everything else. So let me just give you a few examples. In our trade relationship, in addition to the trade war and the trade balance and all of that issue, one of the considerations of the government now is export controls, in China's investment in the United States, and indeed, U.S. investment in the United States, or Chinese investment in the United States fell another 46% last year. I spent a lot of time in the Rust Belt period when we were welcoming Japanese investment in the auto industry. And now we're getting a lot of investment in, I spent time in Ohio, glass factories, Detroit, parts industries for the auto industry, Chinese-owned, is creating employment. But now there's a big suspicion about the various character of Chinese investment, technology transfer back to China, ultimately increasing China's competitiveness by buying through mergers, acquisitions, IPOs, and all of this U.S. technology. So it's spilling over into investment and trade. If you now think about the cultural and educational area, the director of the FBI, Mr. Wray, about a year plus ago, testified in front of the Senate Intelligence Committee and brought up the issue of all this Chinese students and scholars in American research universities and the implications of having them in our laboratories exposed to technology that can't be exported to China. So what I'm saying is that the security relationship has gone south. You think of things, South China Sea not being as helpful on North Korea as we might help, moving closer to the Soviet Union, tightening up on interactions across the Taiwan Straits. There are a whole series of security developments that are indeed troubling, but these are spilling over now into our economic relationship and into our cultural and educational. And you can see it in reports on Chinese influence operations in the United States. And the Asia Society and other NGOs are, now it's a cottage industry on looking at the security implications of intimate relations with China. And don't let me give you the impression I think it's all unwarranted, but it's entirely possible that this can run out of, let's say, the bounds of good judgment and human decency. Also this whole concern is with our allies. Our allies have built enormous relations. China is the leading trading partner of about 130 countries in the world. Japan, China's the #1 trading partner. All of the Southeast Asian countries, Republic of Korea, Taiwan's #1 trading partner. So as our relationship with China becomes more tense, we're putting pressure on our allies to apply export controls and so forth. And of course, this is going to create tension, not only obviously with China, but also with all of our allies who want a balance. They want to benefit economically, even as they protect their equities on that. Now, that raises the interesting question of what are the undergirding perceptions that have changed about China that have created this bipartisan anxiety? And I think there are a number of things that you almost have to ask, what are the lenses through which we're filtering all the information we get about China? And I think one important area is how we're viewing China's capabilities. When I started, I remember having a conversation at the National Academy of Sciences. I went with the National Academy of Sciences group in 1976. Mao had just died. And I remember asking the scientists around, what do you think we have to learn in China? And the answer was nothing. We're going over there to give them information. Now, at the time, I thought that was a little narrow answer. But the answer now is that China is increasing its innovation capability and research capability. You look at patents being issued, China's capabilities are going up. And my basic point is, I think we've gone from a position of underestimating China's capabilities to overestimating. We're beginning to paint a picture of a country that doesn't have some of the enormous problems I believe it has, whether it's demographic problems, urban problems, pollution problems. How do you deal and manage a middle class that has greater expectations? Their middle class is bigger than our middle class, at least by some measures. And so there's rising expectations. China has huge problems. So we have to find a way of giving adequate respect to the genuine capabilities without exaggerating them. So I think we need to think, how are we looking at China's capabilities? Another thing is in the realm of perception is goals. I think, for the last 40 years, we thought China's principal goal and focus was looking internally. solve its internal problems, because causing trouble externally would just divert them from what they needed to maintain their own system. And I think there are a lot of people in China that still think about that. But Mr. Xi Jinping's come into office, and he has more expansive global objectives. And I think if you just sort of ask who was the, as the Chinese would say, the tiger on the mountain of international affairs, it was the United States. And now the Chinese are challenging us in the air, in the sea, in terms of commercial activity, infrastructure building around the world. And I think we just weren't quite prepared for the set of ambitious external goals that China has. So if you married this sudden realization that they're thinking a lot bigger than we thought they were, married with an unrealistic sense of their capabilities unconstrained by problems, you've got a kind of threat that I think there's a basis for some of the thought, but it's aggregating into something I think much more dangerous. Another thing is, I think if at least people like me that studied Chinese foreign policy, we generally viewed for the last 40 years as Chinese leaders were pretty cautious, actually. They weren't very likely to take high risks. Well, I think the general view in Washington now is, and there is some basis for it, is Mr. Xi is willing to take risks that his predecessors weren't, whether it's with respect to making forceful claims in the South China Sea, or for that matter, the East China Sea, or with respect to tightening up on relations with Taiwan or Hong Kong. So we see a Chinese leadership that seems stronger, it has more ambitious goals, and it seems more willing to take risk. So I think that's been a problem. And then the next thing that's changed is what I would say a sense of China's directionality. I think we all saw our relations with China as an up and down, but the trend line was sort of positive. Norms and institutions were being built in China. There were succession norms, 2 terms, then you retire. There was the notion that China was being socialized into the norms and institutions of the world and developing more predictable institutions at home. And while I think people like me never thought it was going to be democratic, we thought it would be more institutionalized and predictable. And I think Mr. Xi has shaken our confidence on this, just most obviously by doing away with the norm of 2 terms and you retire. He's decided not to do that. But he's also built, and that's what my article was in a sense of, he's building a structure for personal strongman control. Also, technology has come along. And we have all this surveillance technology, big data technology. Let me just give you little things sort of stick in your mind, but maybe have big implications. I was in China about a year and a half ago, and you've seen these bike sharing companies. This one was Mobike, and Mobike had us to their corporate headquarters, and they had this huge screen with all these dots moving. And this was each of their bikes. And they could identify which person is on the bike, obviously where they were going, and by implication, you could follow everybody in real time, right down to where they were at that instant. And of course, and you do it through the payment system and GPS and all of this. And then that same trip went down to Guangdong and drove to Hong Kong and the highway. And there were all these, what I thought were speed monitors, but they weren't speed monitors, they were facial recognition. And everybody in the car, by the time you got to the Hong Kong border, they knew who was in the car's history, heaven knows. But the point is, China's strongman leader now is sitting in the midst of a technological revolution that makes the possibilities of social control something that for the last 40 years, we weren't really thinking of China's direction as that of a surveillance state. So what I'm really trying to say is these underlying views, unrealistic in many respects, of China's capabilities, unrealistic views of many of their goals. And in fact, Chinese debate about what their goals ought to be. And Xi Jinping's not going to be the last word. And a loss in confidence in China's basic direction may not be as we would have preferred, but we could certainly easily tolerate. That confidence, I think, has been shaken. So underneath, if you ask, how do you begin to repair this relationship, you have to deal with these underlying perceptions. And I haven't even talked about what the Chinese are thinking about us. And there's a whole set of analyses there, whether it's the trade war, whether it's sanctions. But to put just a word on it, the Chinese believe now our national objective is containment, to put a word on it. And they look at a couple of documents in the last year, the national strategy of the United States in late 2017. They look at the national defense strategy of early 2018. They look at Vice President Pence's speech of October of 2018. And it doesn't take a lot of imagination if you're a Chinese to think the United States is reacting to our perceived capabilities, our behavior, our direction with the objective of at least slowing us down, if not a more sort of inimical set of values. Then you ask, well, what is our security apparatus in both countries doing? And quite frankly, they're each using the other as their planning horizon for conflict. If you're going to have a big military, you need a big scale problem. And China, through a combination of both misperception and its own behavior, has put itself as the obvious target. Most people that are in the security apparatus would say, long-term problem, China, Russia's a big problem in the short run, but keep your eye on China. That's sort of the organization. So then the question is, so if this is sort of where we're headed, what might we think about doing about all this in a kind of constructive vein? Now, I think the first thing is we have to get our history right. Engagement, in many respects, was phenomenally successful. And let me just give you a couple of examples. When I first went to China in 1976, you flew on a Chinese CAAC. China Airlines always crashes. That's what we sort of joked about the abbreviation. But it had a pretty bad safety record, let's just put it that way. And Boeing and the Civil Aviation Administration of the United States, CAB, worked with China, and we had commercial interest to be sure because we wanted to sell all this air traffic control. But China now has one of the most safe, in fact, it has a safety record as good or better than the United States in air transportation. And that's and it's worked to our benefit in terms of sales of aircraft, but tourism and everything that's come out of all of that. And that was Chinese and American cooperation. Take food, just one other example. National Academy of Sciences, National Academy of Engineering, American food industry worked with China to reduce what was a loss rate in its vegetables in the 1980s of 50%. It's been reduced down to about 20 to, well, let's just say 20%. To 20%. So a 30% reduction in the loss of food from harvest to dinner table. The nutritional advantage of Chinese and American cooperation has been enormous. So I think we need to, first of all, not just talk about like the last 40 years was a big mistake. At the very human level, this has been enormously beneficial both to Chinese and to the United States. Second, I think what we need to think about doing is increasing what I would call locality to locality ties. If you asked what happened with the U.S. and China for the last 40 years, we went from Mao and Deng and Zhou Enlai and Kissinger and Brzezinski and Carter and Mao talking to one another, what I would call an elite to elite relationship, to now a society-to-society relationship. And as our two national governments find it more and more difficult to talk, I think it becomes more and more important for our localities, our states, our cities, our educational institutions, our civil society in both countries to do everything we can to maintain the fabric of at least a constructive dimension to what is not necessarily at the national level going to look like a very constructive relationship. And that's not going to be easy. And in fact, I think if you go back and look at Vice President Pence's speech, he, in a sense, warns local government not to be in a position of undermining central U.S. Washington foreign policy. So there's going to be a tugging and hauling here on what kind of equipment you buy for your cities, whether it's telecommunications or anything else. There's going to be what kind of investments you welcome into your community. And obviously, we have some legitimate security concerns we ought to pursue. But what I'm saying is this relationship is very important, and we have to do everything we can, it seems to me, to sustain it. A third thing is that we have a tendency, as I would put it this way, as our relations with China become more strained, we tend to want to move towards a more intimate relationship with the people of Taiwan. And all I would say on that topic is that we need to be careful how we manage this relationship. And you need to know only the following to get what I mean. There's something called the Taiwan Travel Act, which I think was actually not a bad idea as a general idea. But it passed unanimously in the U.S. Congress. And all I would say is when something unanimously passes in the U.S. Congress, watch out. You probably got evidence of a lot of momentum against a bad idea, or at least the operational. So I would say we've got to manage this issue of Taiwan, even though as our relations with China become more tenuous, we tend to become more sympathetic to this democratic society with which we've had such long and intimate relations. And finally, I've spent time talking, because we're an American audience, talking about American views, but I would say to my Chinese friends, there's a very fundamental reality behind American views, and that is China used to be poor and weak. It's not poor and weak. It's got poor and weak problems and pockets, but as an aggregate, it is not a poor and weak country. And the kind of special arrangements that were cut in the past with, I think, both good intention and not entirely bad effects is no longer justified, and our people are not going to put up with the lack of what's going now as reciprocity. Why should China be able to build a multi-story building in Washington, D.C. that houses almost unlimited media when the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal, and the New York Times have trouble getting visas for their reporters? It just doesn't strike, and it shouldn't strike people as fair. Why should China be able to invest in any American industry? Practically, it's tightening up now as part of the process, but basically an open investment environment when whatever you want to say about investment in China, it's not an open investment environment. So I think the Chinese have their work cut out. They're going to have to find a way to make this a more reciprocal relationship. And Americans are right to ask for that. On the other hand, we shouldn't paint China as with set of capabilities, goals, and directions that are fixed and ipso facto entirely not in our interest, because we will produce the result we profess to oppose. So I hope all of us can take away from this set of remarks and this evening that this is a very important relationship. It's going to be more difficult to manage in the next, let's say, 40 years than the last 40 years, perhaps. But we don't really have a choice but try to manage it. And but ultimately it's going to call for China to make some changes too. It just can't be us. Thank you very much, and I understood there'd be some questions.
We open the floor for the questions. When you ask questions, please identify yourself and try to be brief, and with a question mark. Don't make non-statement. And we have a microphone here. If you are having questions, you can come to the front. Anyone? Anyone have questions? You want to go?
Yeah, I'm Roger Day. Trained in political science in the 70s. And you spoke to Richard Nixon's approach to Russia and China and placing them in opposition with each other. And it was similar to one of my professors speaking of what he described as the three pancake theory, that two will always pair together. Could you elaborate a little bit further on that?
Well, there's sort of the odd man out phenomenon, might be the two against one. This is, I think, raises an important point that probably calls for some discussion. At the current time, if those documents that I talked about, the U.S. national strategy, our defense strategy, Vice President Pence's speech, are sort of three big pieces of this emerging policy. I take Russia and China to be the principal problems we face, which means we're sort of seen as two against us now, that in a way the strategic triangle's been reversed, although the context is a lot different. And I guess my underlying feeling is that is really a bad position for the U.S. to be in. The fundamental policy, I think, going back to the earliest days of our republic, were that the interest the United States has in Asia is that no other single power or group of powers controls Asia, that it's divided it up enough that that entire space and all of the resources, human, natural resource, trading potential, not be under the domination of a coalition that's adverse to us. And it seems to me what we've adopted as national policy is forcing or encouraging the United States, is encouraging Russia and China to operate not as they did during the Cold War to that degree, like in Vietnam and so forth, but nonetheless to operate and at least go in parallel tracks that are adverse to the U.S. So I think our big strategic problem is how do we treat China and Russia in a way that doesn't drive them together in a way adverse to us? And so I think we're kind of looking at nothing's an exact parallel, but I think it's not in our interest to define China and Russia as our two major strategic problems and then say we're going to devote the resources necessary to deal with them both. I remember, and my good friend Ash Carter, former defense, and I agree with many things that Ash said, but I remember hearing him give a speech in Washington at the Economic Club, and he says, we can't afford not to get the resources necessarily to deal with both China and Russia at the same time. I understand the spirit behind that, but what is our resource capability? Can we really do that? Not to mention our domestic demands for investment, old age, retirement, all of the competing demands. So I think what bothers me most is that we are headed in a direction that's two against one, and we're the one. And that strikes me as where you don't want to be. Now, it's easy to describe the problem. From my viewpoint, I just did describe the problem. What do you do about it? That's not so easy. But I'm pretty convinced we're not on a productive strategic course here. Is that responsive?
Okay, any more questions? Yeah, we have a microphone. The student. Oh, here, behind you, yeah.
Hi, I'm Irfan Hussein, and I just have a question about what's your take on what some people have described as the inevitable competition for resources around the world as Chinese economy gets bigger and as what the Chinese are doing, Xi Jinping's signature initiative of the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI, and is there anything that can be done from a US standpoint to counter that, to safeguard acquisition of resources around the world?
Yeah.
We take a couple questions if we save time. Any more questions? No more question. I add one more question here. 2 years ago, when Mike talked at Carter Center, he mentioned that a tipping point came before Trump came to office. Now, this has moved beyond the tipping point because we see so many conflicts. People even talk about new Cold War. So in that context, what is your assessment of the President Trump's policy toward China? To what extent Trump policy has been contributed to the worsening of the relationship, or somehow make the tipping point when you talk about moving slower? So how do you assess that? So maybe we have the two questions together.
Okay. Competition on resources. Of course, as China moves up the economic value chain and consumption chain, and of course, part of China's economic strategy is to get its consumption up. So even efficiency gains aside, China will be consuming more and needs more resources. And so it's going to be going into the world, it's going to be going into space, it's going to be going under the sea in quest of not just resources, but including resources. So that's sort of the competitive dimension. But I did mention the rising innovation that's happening in China. We all know they got a planned economy and they constrain free thought in universities and propaganda, and that's not conducive to innovation in many respects. But the long and the short of it is China's scientists and scholars, that we're talking about the contemporary Journal of Contemporary China and citation counts, China in the major scientific journals in the world is occupying a growing percentage of the innovative research going on. And China has a lot of advantages in big data. So there are fields where I think China can make contributions that increase efficiency and minimize use of resources, develop new resources, and so on. So I think this quest for resources and innovation, China will create demand, but China will help solve demands too. I remember I was an undergraduate, I took a course from Paul Ehrlich, Population Bomb. There are going to be so many people on the world that we're not going to make it to 2010, right? But somehow we've got a lot of problems, and maybe it's going to be different with climate change and all of this. But it's the human nature to, I think, keep pushing the production utility curve out. And so, yes, we're going to have more competition for resources, but hopefully if we can work together in scientific and technological areas, which the security problem makes pretty difficult at the current time, I'm a little optimistic. Now, BRI, just so happens I'm writing a book on China building high-speed rail from South China to Singapore. And there are upsides and downsides, and I'll just, because it's late and everybody's, it's a long evening, I'll telegraph what I think in a more bold form than I would want to defend if we had a half hour to talk about it. But I think we are kind of missing the boat. We didn't send anybody to this Beijing Belt and Road Forum. We were opposed to the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. There are pluses and there's an argument to be made. I don't mean there's no argument. But the long and the short of it is that China is aligning itself. I've been interviewing in 8 countries in Asia, and they pretty much subscribe to the proposition that if you want to get rich, build a road. That's the cliche. In other words, if you want development, you can't wait for people to get developed and build the roads or the communications pathways or the fiber optics. You have to create the infrastructure, and then growth congeals around it. And so BRI is, in a way, and I don't want to sound like some propagandist for the Beijing, but the Chinese have aligned themselves to what developing countries, for the most part, see as important: building infrastructure. And China is building it in a way that makes itself the hub for this emerging economic system. So I don't think we ought to oppose a good idea. We ought to try to balance this connectivity. So if China's trying to funnel everything towards Beijing, just to put it crudely in rail, we ought to be building from India across Vietnam and Cambodia and building that way through Thailand. We ought to recognize that, the Chinese maybe have, now there's all the issue of financing, environmental impact statements. Are we displacing people? Yes. China's made all sorts of errors. But the point is, underneath it, there's a there. And we're aligning ourselves against a good idea poorly implemented. We ought to be aligning with the idea and better implemented. And we can work with Japan, we can work with Korea, we can work with France, we can work with Germany. So I think we're entirely in this somewhere between alarmed at Chinese capabilities and self-satisfied. It's a kind of really dangerous combination. We ought to recognize the world is changing, and we've got to get in there and help structure that change. You get my drift? Yeah. Oh, yeah, the tipping point, and did Trump make it worse? Is that the question? Yeah, yeah. Yes, but I would say it deserves more than that, because actually the Chinese, if you ask who were they, I think, in favor of, they were for Trump. So he's actually managed to turn them around. So that's a whole interesting story. But I would say what makes it worse really is that one of our biggest assets is our allies. And we're not only working with our allies, we're working against them. And then the multilateral business, the trade TPP, I thought, broadly speaking, terrific idea, gives us leverage over China. They're going to want in it if it's successful, like the WTO. That's a whole story. But basically, I think he squandered our biggest assets. Is that a good way to end?
Thank you all for coming for tonight evening dinner, and also congratulations again to the 2 recipients. And thank Ambassador Hill, thank Provost. And also you can see we have the plaque. Their names are at DU forever. So we'll see how many years we can go from here. And our Provost first year, hopefully will be 10th year, 18th year, and 28th year. We'll see 40 years. Okay, thank you all for coming, driving safely. The weather we ordered better than you came, for sure.